Hello, 10th grade students. I'm here to talk with you about some of the background that you need to understand as you begin to read the memoir Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. I want to talk with you a little bit about the history of slavery in the United States and where Harriet Jacobs falls in that history. So to start, it's hard to underestimate the impact of slavery on American culture. Only 20 African slaves were brought to Jamestown Colony in 1618, and by the eve of the Civil War in 1860, almost 4 million slaves lived in the southern United States. Harriet Jacobs' narrative is situated within the context of the steady expansion of slavery in the United States and then its eventual abolition. Although slavery grew slowly at first, slavery eventually expanded throughout all of the American colonies. Its presence was most obvious in the southern colonies, including Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia, where cash crops such as tobacco, cotton, rice, and indigo became the major commodities. For various reasons, slavery did not gain such a footing in the northern colonies. This was due in part to the economic and geographic differences of the northern colonies. The region was not suitable for the cultivation of labor-intensive crops. Also, the predominance of religious groups, such as the Quakers in Pennsylvania and the Puritans of New England, may have contributed to the relative lack of slavery. By the start of the American Revolution, 400,000 slaves were located in southern colonies, compared to 50,000 in the northern colonies. At the Constitutional Convention, slavery was hotly debated. Rather than settle the issue by abolishing slavery, the Founding Fathers agreed to the Three-Fifths Compromise, allowing slave states to count a portion of their slave population for representation. Slavery continued to steadily expand in the southern United States after the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793. The value of cotton exports made up an increasingly larger share of the value of all U.S. exports throughout the 19th century. Slaves brought to the United States from Africa endured a harrowing journey referred to as the Middle Passage. Almost 20% of the captives died on the journey due to the horrendous conditions they endured. Most often, slaves were first brought to the West Indies and then North America. In the United States, the importation of slavery was banned in 1808. This did little to stop slavery from growing. However, as slaves were continually traded and many more were smuggled into the country. The population of slaves in America grew to around 2 million by 1830, when Harriet Jacobs was a young woman. It's also interesting to note that in Harriet Jacobs' narrative, she talks about the expansion of slavery through a really sordid enterprise, which was slave masters who would rape their slaves and produce more slaves through that method. It's a really, really shocking thing that she reveals in her narrative. Plantation life is something that you need to understand as you're understanding Harriet Jacobs, her life and experiences, and also her fears. The majority of slaves lived on large plantations, and most, 80 to 90%, worked in the fields. At the same time, only a small minority of Southern planters owned 20 or more slaves. In the South, wealth was consolidated in the hands of a small minority of white plantation owners. Cotton cultivation was back-breaking work. Slaves had to endure long hours of work in hot temperatures, often expected to pick 150 to 200 pounds of cotton per day. Slaves were induced to work frequently through the use of draconian punishments, especially whipping. Slave traders frequently tore slave families apart, and slaves had to endure the humiliation of public auctions. Female slaves, as you'll read about in Harriet Jacobs' narrative, frequently suffered sexual abuse. Slaves were not allowed to marry, attend separate church services, learn to read and write, or own property. Slaves managed to retain some aspects of their culture despite the horrific situations in which they lived. Music, crafts, storytelling, and familial allegiances endured. Slaves also resisted their position of subservience more openly. Some slaves engaged in workplace sabotage, destroying tools, freeing livestock, and staging work slowdowns, and also faking illness. Some slaves pushed their resistance in open rebellion, including the Stono Rebellion of 1739 and, very famously, Nat Turner's Rebellion in 1831, which Harriet Jacobs makes reference to. Many more escaped or attempted escape by running away to the free states in the North. The Underground Railroad was a loose network of escape routes and safe houses used to ferry slaves out of bondage. Both African Americans and whites publicly criticized slavery in the United States. The abolition movement grew increasingly organized and active in the 1800s. Some of the most well-known abolitionists include William Lloyd Garrison, David Walker, Frederick Douglass, Sarah and Angela Grimke, and Lucretia Mott. They were joined by throngs of men and women, religious groups, and social activists in their call for the abolition of slavery and the emancipation of slaves. We can't underestimate the impact of literature on the movement of abolition and the increase in the movement of abolition. The novel Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe and various dramatizations of that novel that were created by different playwrights and performed around the country spread the social awareness of the evils of slavery. And our writer, Harriet Jacobs, who wrote Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, was in contact and communication with Harriet Beecher Stowe and other white female abolitionists in the North who she hoped would promote her memoir and spread it as part of the cause of abolition. As the institution of slavery grew, harsh slave codes were enacted and refined throughout the South. These codes restricted slave activities and meted out strict punishments, often whipping. Attempting to shore up slavery and in response to congressional limits on slavery in new territories, Southern legislators fought for the inclusion of the Fugitive Slave Law as part of the Compromise of 1850. This law was instrumental in fomenting abolition in the North. Whereas abolition had been a fringe movement at the start of the 19th century, the institution of the Fugitive Slave Law, which forced northern states to be complicit in slavery, increased awareness of the abolition movement and made more people more vocal in their desire to end slavery in the United States. According to the Fugitive Slave Law, alleged fugitives would be returned to slavery on the basis of a statement by the slave owner. They were not allowed to a trial by jury, the right to counsel, or to testify on their own behalf. At the same time, any person who harbored a fugitive faced harsh punishments and fines. So this is just some information that I wanted to present to you about some of the context that is good to understand as you're reading Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. I hope that you enjoy reading the first chapters, and I look forward to discussing them with you on Monday.